Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this module of the State Library of Iowa's Core Endorsement Program. It is part of the Foundations of Public Libraries module, and we are talking right now about the principles of a noble profession. And that is a lot to take on, but we'll take it in smaller chunks. And whether you are watching this module as the start of your time in the endorsement program, or maybe you're further along and circling back to this, maybe you're just auditing this content for your information. You're interested or curious in the role of public libraries in our culture and society. I'm glad you're here. So my name is Samantha Bowers. I am the consultant for continuing education at the State Library of Iowa. What that means is that basically I assist the state library as it runs a certification program. We call that endorsement. I also coordinate the continuing ed and professional development that we offer to the folks working in the more than 540 public libraries in the state of Iowa. Such a rich tradition and history. I'm so proud to be part of that. But a little bit about my background before we get into the content here. I did get my master's in library and information science from the University of Iowa. I graduated back in 2012. And before I did my master's there, I did an undergraduate in journalism and religious studies. It was really an exciting time, lots of fun stuff going on. But since I finished that up, I have worked in a variety of different kinds of libraries. And one of the things we're going to talk about as we work our way through the content of this module is how the mission of a library has evolved over time and why not every library is a public library. And so as we started thinking about what it means to be part of the noble profession, again, that word being a bit of a mouthful in this context, as I was thinking about my own work history and how much that intersected with different missions of libraries, I was really excited to take on this content. So I worked in school in a seminary library, serving the students of that school. I also worked in a more traditional academic library environment, doing reference and instruction. And then a good chunk of my career actually has been spent in the corporate sector before I came here to the State Library of Iowa and now liaise with public libraries around the state. So I have that background that touches a lot of different kinds of library service, and it's so exciting to see how the role that a public library can play in its community and in the lives of its patrons. So one of the big overarching goals for our time together today is to connect the practicality of what we do working in public libraries with that history, the tradition of life in libraries, and then kind of tie it all together and see why it even matters. So here's these learning objectives spelled out a little more clearly. We are going to, as I already mentioned, we are going to talk about those different kinds of libraries throughout history, how they're similar and how they're different to the modern public library. We're going to talk about this idea coined by a researcher of vocational awe, and that is a mouthful, but it's a concept worth exploring, and I think it's something that you're going to connect with, especially if you're currently working as a professional in a public library. I think you're going to see where that term can come into play. We're going to thoroughly define what exactly a public library is, especially as it compares to the different kinds of libraries that have existed and do exist throughout our information spaces. And then we're going to kind of just talk through how different supporting elements are essential to your life in a public library. I will also just pause here to put an asterisk on this topic to say that when I was doing my master's, we did an entire semester-long course on this topic called Cultural Foundations, and that's not atypical. So we're going to bang through this in probably about 30 minutes, but let's just say you could really dig into this and spend a lot more time thinking about it. I've included some references throughout, but just know that we are barely skimming the surface here. So our first learning objective, what is a library? So I put this slide together. I'm not going to read all of it. It's very tiny, as you can see, but some of the different missions that have existed that libraries have played throughout history. So when before the Common Era, thousands of years, writing has existed. But basically, as soon as people started writing stuff down, they needed a way to keep track of it. And that was kind of how libraries first popped up. Largely, these were mercantile records, some written laws. You do see a little bit of literature, but very little. From that sort of mercantile administrative role, the role of library sort of evolved into one of preservation of religious texts. So largely people fulfilling the leadership role in whatever religion it happened to be in that area could be the only literate people, the only people who could read or write. So you can think of your Jewish rabbis, Christian monks to some extent, although not in not before the Common Era would you have Christian monks, but basically those literate people were the ones preserving their culture and not necessarily paying as much attention to other cultures that were not theirs. The first we begin to see a little bit broader cultural role that the library could play was in Assyria. When they really did take a broader look at their culture as a whole, beyond the religion, beyond the law, beyond the administration, and say, what do we want people to know about our future? What do we want people of the future to know about their past? And so definitely something that grew out of that are sort of your university library or your school library. A mission that won't surprise anybody is books as a personal status symbol. So even into the Roman era, the majority of the populace, even the wealthy people in the population, were not literate. And yet illiterate, wealthy Romans would collect scrolls. This influenced by the Greeks, who were more literate than the Romans, but still just these massive personal libraries that they couldn't even interact with. As we move through, this is kind of a big jump here through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Libraries became a sort of national and cultural pride. We do see a little bit here where we might begin to say, well, this feels a little bit like a public library in the breadth and scope of what they're collecting. And yet these libraries were not open to everyone. You had to be a member of the right class in order to access. And still illiteracy, a large issue here. But that mission of saying we are the best country and here's how our literature and how our written record exemplifies that. And then another example as libraries have evolved is in the Industrial Revolution, and this is a topic near and dear to my heart, having worked for a long time in a corporate library, was that companies needed a way to store and organize knowledge that was really specialized to their industry. So you can look at organizations like the Special Libraries Association that evolved out of this need to say, well, you've got this kind of niche knowledge management issue where we really need to track specialized information as it relates to this particular topic. And so companies stood up these libraries and stood up these collections. But one common thing throughout all of this history, and I hope that this is clear to you, is that in one way or another, all these libraries existed based on who was not allowed to be part of that library. So if you couldn't read or write, if you were part of a minority in that culture, if you were perhaps a slave or a conquered people group, you didn't look like the dominant group. All of these were reasons to keep you out of that library, and or if you didn't work for the company, for example, as we get into the 1900s, if you couldn't demonstrate a need to be in that space, you didn't have a need to be in that space. And so not a public library in the way that we think of public libraries today. There are a couple other types of libraries that are worth talking about when we think about the history of libraries, and especially here in the United States. Social libraries began to pop up. And as you can read on the slide, these were largely subscription libraries. You paid maybe even a small fee, but you did pay a fee to access that collection, but they also served a public purpose. So everything in the collection was aimed at lessening some social ill, whatever the society thought that ill was. If it was, maybe they promoted a culture of prohibition or parenting, other types of topics, but they sort of picked a social issue, built a collection around it, and then people subscribed to that library. It was entirely voluntary, but it was subsidized through donations and subscription fees. You also, from a collections perspective, the circulating libraries were among the first to sort of meet this need that we begin to see for people to read books for fun, that they would be allowed to not read something related to their company or their religion or their country, that they would just be allowed to read what they wanted to read, whether or not it furthered a social aim. So these circulating libraries began to include popular literature, which earned them some ire from the powers that be, but it was just that entertainment value. People wanted to read books for fun. These, as you can see on the slide, were also not really a public library in that they existed for profit. Again, a sort of subscription model where you might subscribe to that library and get the newest trade paperbacks or whatever it was. But I set all this up for you so that you can see how we finally built our way to a public library. And you can start doing research and find, he spent 100 days doing research and find kind of 100 different answers, but no one's really sure who the first truly public library was in the United States. One source I read, and an early one for sure, was the town of Peterborough, New Hampshire, back in 1834, was the first to sort of say, all right, we're going to use taxpayer money, we're going to have a building, we're going to have a collection, and it's going to be open to everybody, and we're not going to set strict limits on what can be in that collection. We are a public library. Certainly Boston in the 1850s, the first major public library. And in this era, you really are seeing language of the public library as filling almost a religious role in society. Even though we're not collecting exclusively religious texts like some other libraries throughout history had been, it was described as a cathedral to advance learning. And we're going to get into this sort of tension a little bit, but so on the one hand, you have this idea that it was a cathedral to learning, but then on the other hand, it really was intended to be a place for everyone. This certainly hasn't been true of all public libraries throughout history. You can look at things like the Jim Crow era in the South and other exclusionary practices, some through ignorance and some through just willful exclusion, especially when it comes to African Americans in the public space. But that was the ideal, and that is the tension. And I have a picture on the slide here of Andrew Carnegie. If you grew up in Iowa, you may know of a Carnegie Library. He was a huge donor to public libraries, not only in Iowa, but all throughout the United States. And in 1886 through about 1920, he donated millions and millions of dollars. In today's dollars, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars to build libraries throughout the United States, including 101 libraries here in Iowa. Not all of them still standing, not all of them, the buildings still functioning as libraries, but his money is certainly a huge role in getting the idea of the public library into the common vernacular. And again, with Andrew Carnegie, we kind of see this tension because he was hugely passionate about learning and about libraries. He himself grew up in a family without a lot of money and really took refuge in the public library. And yet, on the other hand, he got his money in the steel industry and really hated when his employees would attempt to unionize and educate themselves through books, reading, and libraries. And so you kind of just got this sense that he wanted people to be in public libraries and he really valued the role that those public libraries play. But he also really fought against this idea that that really was for everyone. He sort of had an idea of who should be involved and who shouldn't. You often see Carnegie libraries. This is an example from Fairfield in the bottom of your slide here, where you had to go up some stairs. You ascended to learning and knowledge in these big lofty spaces. But he also, Carnegie himself, as he gave money to these libraries, was really insistent that they be a community space, that they have children's rooms, that they have community rooms, that everyone can be involved. So this sort of tension that I've been describing throughout our time together still plays in today's libraries, I think. And this quote on the screen here is by a researcher named Fabazi Attar. And we do begin to see now this idea of vocational awe, which I mentioned in our learning objectives. And this tension as it manifests itself today in 2023. So here's the quote. It says, "The physical space of a library has been a sacred space." And you can get this idea in the picture in the background of the slide is the Boston Public Library reading room. I mean, just an amazingly ornate space that certainly designed to inspire silence and awe when you walk into it. In a way that a church might. And Attar goes on to say, one could argue it is treated like a sanctuary. So if you've ever been in a big old church, a cathedral or a basilica, you sort of have this sense that when you walk in, you're supposed to be quiet. And this is true of other religious spaces as well. So she goes on to say, if libraries are sacred spaces, it stands to reason that its workers are priests. So you can see now, I'm not calling you a priest or a priestess necessarily if you work in a public library today, but what do we do with all of this role of libraries as the educator of the masses, and yet exclusionary in some practices, that we're supposed to be welcoming to everybody, and that means everybody, and that really means that we can't be kicking people out or shushing people or advocating for ourselves as workers and people. All of this has kind of led to this idea of vocational awe, and this is how she defines that. A set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves. So it's okay you may have had these thoughts as you've started working in a library or have been working in a library, and the profession that believes that libraries are as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. But I hope you've seen, as we've gone through this whirlwind history of libraries and their role from keepers of the law and the merchant records up through religious uses and corporate uses, that libraries are not beyond critique, that libraries are systems and systems can be flawed. And so you don't have to have this super high-minded ideal. And I know we called this this module Principles of a Noble Profession, and it's true, it is a noble profession, and it's certainly something worth fighting for. But on the other hand, we're people, we're workers. We run a space that's just like any other public space in some ways. And so it's okay to acknowledge that tension, to live in that tension. And before we close, I want to give us some advice for navigating that tension, but we'll work our way through some of the rest of this. So we've talked about the history of libraries. We've talked about how it's led us up to this idea that we are priests and priestesses in sacred space. But this next slide really kind of pops that bubble a little bit. It just defines the 6 pillars of what makes a public library. And it's not that you have a holier than thou space. It's not that you have a space that makes you shut up when you walk in. It's not that you have collections that are perfect or programming that is, all inclusive and totally in line and all of this stuff. A public library is simply defined by these 6 elements. This is probably the slide I'm going to spend the most time actually reading from my notes on, because I certainly don't want to give you any factual or legal misinformation about a public library, but The first bullet, of course, supported by taxes. You are likely to have supplemental funding in your library from things like a friend or foundations, other grants, your direct state aid money from the State Library of Iowa. But Iowa law does require that your library be supported by city and county tax revenue. You are only a public library if you are governed by a board. Again, I hope these bullet points are easy compare and contrast points for you as we think about the history of libraries throughout time. But most of our libraries here in Iowa have a governing board, meaning that your mayor appoints trustees, and those trustees work together to set the strategic plan, hire the director, and approve policy. This setup is supposed to insulate the library from government and political influence and safeguard intellectual freedom. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the library law courses, as well as the intellectual freedom course. There are a handful of libraries in Iowa, I think it might just be 2 or 3, that have advisory boards, which does give more decision-making authority on some of those things like collection development and intellectual freedom to the city government, but that really is a rarity in Iowa, especially. The public library is entirely voluntary, as opposed to, say, like your public school system. Kids have to be in school. No one has to use the library or library services. A public library is established by law, and I just want to read this sentence for you. All Iowa cities and counties are required to levy a tax for the purpose of providing financial support to the public library, which provides library services within that jurisdiction. Your public library is established by an ordinance adopted by the city council, and that ordinance is the local law under which the library exists, and that's part of city code. So again, very different from the other kinds of libraries throughout history. And also, I think this really brings us down to earth when we think about our lives as professionals. We're city employees, and we're fulfilling this role that we have to play within our library service area. I think this is not going to be a surprise to anyone, but library services are free. This isn't to say you can't charge for anything. You may have fines on part or all of your collection. If they come back overdue, you may charge for a specialized event. But in general, you're not going to charge someone a subscription fee to use your library. And then the last thing of what really makes a public library, we've talked about this throughout our time together so far, is that the public library is open to everyone. So I hope this goes without saying as you read this slide, but people of all ages, abilities, nationalities, ethnicities, religions, genders, etc., should feel welcome in your library. We've talked about throughout time how this hasn't always been the case. I've already mentioned the Jim Crow laws and the exclusionary practices that many public libraries had, not only in the South, but throughout the U.S., especially as they related to Native Americans. As they related to African Americans. Of course, this has also been true of Native Americans throughout history. We also can see this in treatment of other ethnic and religious minorities, that they maybe haven't been welcome in public spaces, but everyone has a First Amendment right to your library, to your public space. I also want to just pause here to say, if you're not really sure what everyone in your community looks like, the state library has tools. You can head to the State Data Center to find information on the U.S. Census, or perhaps on the American Community Survey to learn about the people in your community. What nationalities are they? What languages are they speaking? Are they commuting? How far do they live? What does your town make up? And so you can use kind of all of those quantitative and demographic tools to inform services in your library. So we've been talking about this profession as the noble profession, and we do have these 2 definitions of noble. It's been, I think libraries in history have been both of these definitions, the first being belonging to a hereditary class with high social political status, aristocratic. That is really not what we want for modern public library services in the 21st century. We really do want to be that second definition of noble, that we're showing fine personal qualities, high moral principles, and ideals. So we're welcoming to everyone. We are thinking consciously about the programming we offer and the services we provide and the collection we develop. So Is librarianship a noble profession? It absolutely is. But does that mean it has to be scary? No, it does not. So I've outlined this slide here as we think about sort of that first definition of noble and maybe some traditional ideas around what library service is and means, into this second definition of noble, the more inclusive and idealistic idea of noble. As we think about how libraries have evolved throughout time, we can see that they've gone from status symbols, either of a person or a country or a company, to more service oriented. How are we inviting our community into this space? Who's allowed to be here? How can we improve our community through literacy programming, through entertainment programming and educational programming? When we think about the collections we've held, that we hold, they've gone from sort of scholarly or really narrow purpose into popular literature. And this is why we feel okay as libraries buying, books that we think, I would never read that. I would put that in the trash column. But we say, you know what? The community wants to read it, and that is a-okay. We can still stock the classics. You can still have War and Peace on your shelves, but that doesn't mean you don't open it up to the new bestsellers as well. In the collection development modules, we'll talk a little bit about how to identify what should and shouldn't be in your collection, but certainly worth calling out here. Access kind of goes along with philosophy as well. Who is not allowed to use this collection? Who can't read? Who doesn't look like us? Who's not in power? To equity and inclusion. So everyone should feel welcome here. Everyone should see themselves represented here. We think about our space. We're not necessarily designing library spaces with the intention to awe and silence people anymore. And we're going to talk more about this in the Library as Place module as well. But our space really is designed to be utilized and enjoyed by our community. And how we think about the priorities of a library have shifted. We're not just thinking about the stuff that we have, we really are thinking about our users. All of the pictures, by the way, this is a good time to take a time out and say all of these pictures that have been included in my presentation throughout are examples from Iowa Public Libraries. And so, I kind of love this example here of in the top in Ottawa Public Library. So this is a beautiful space. It certainly is lovely. It has those high wood beams and those big windows. And yet throughout the library, you see hand-drawn art tacked on the walls. You see these big fun colors. You see things displayed. You see welcome computers that are available for use. And so it really is about engaging the community. The second picture down is of a librarian doing story time in the park. In this case, she did not demand that the users came to her library, but she was thinking about her users, and she was thinking, how can I equalize library service and get to people who might not come to the library? I'll go to the park. And then down below as well, this in the Sioux Center Public Library, they looked around, they were getting a growing number of Spanish speakers, and they said, what's a service that we could offer to this community? We could connect people who speak Spanish with people who want to learn to speak Spanish and have a conversation club. So it's not about the collection that they have. It's not about excluding certain people because they don't speak the right language. It's about saying, how can we provide service in our community and equalize the role of the library for folks? These next couple slides, just some more examples of what this might look like inside your library: community meeting room space, a puzzle table, a welcoming space no matter how big or small, places for people to learn and grow and explore inside your library, but also outside your library. So sometimes as we think through these evolutions in library service, it gets a little intimidating to think, how can I make this happen inside my space? I have constraints X, Y, or Z. I don't have enough parking. I don't have enough staff. But begin to think outside your library as well, whether that's a story walk or partnering with community organizations on some sort of event in town, a bookmobile, a bike-mobile. The possibilities are endless, and this does not have to happen inside the four walls of your library. This next slide is simply an encouragement to say, we've had a lot that we've journeyed through in the last half hour or so together, but we don't have to be scared. Here is the concluding slide. So you do not have to be all things to all people. I know we've been talking about how libraries used to have these really narrow foci that you were really, I'm only serving the people who subscribe. I'm only serving the people who work for this company. I'm only serving the people who speak this language or write or read. And now in the public library, we're looking at it and say, well, really, you have to be welcoming to everyone. But that does not mean you have to be all things to all people. You can look at your community. We're going to talk about this in later modules. Look at your community and say, what really would be the most beneficial to the people in my town, in my service area? Related to that, you do not have to do this alone in your community. We're going to talk a lot more about partnerships as we go through these different modules, but look at the people in your town that have similar missions to you and begin to evaluate who could you partner with. You also do not have to do this in a professional vacuum. I mentioned there are 540 odd public libraries in the state of Iowa. Begin to identify those that might look similar to you, that might serve similar populations to you or similarly sized to you, and build a network. You also, of course, have the state library to support you. You have a district consultant. You have others at the state library who are willing to answer your questions and help you out. Kind of related to this idea of vocational awe, you do have to find balance. So this might mean saying, I can't do this program because I have this family need I have to attend to, and that is okay. Your library will never do another program if they burn you out and lose their librarian. So do take care of yourself and begin to find that balance. I know that a lot of people come into librarianship from a second career, and I think that gives a great lens into being more balanced. So remind yourself of that, that you do not have to do everything all at once. And that you are a real person who deserves things like lunch breaks and vacation days. So work within your policies and work with your board or your director, and take care of yourself. You do have to advocate for your library in the community. We've talked about this huge, long history of what public library or what libraries have been in the past. And oftentimes you'll find in interacting with leadership in your town or even average citizens in your town that they have a different idea of what the library should be. Maybe they think you're just a collection of books. What are you doing all this programming and outreach for? But you get to remind them of the role that a public library can play in the community. And I say this as your CE consultant, but you do have to keep learning. So we're going to go through these different modules of the endorsement program, and that's a start. But continuing education and professional development are going to be instrumental and so important to you to learn not only about sort of big picture, what might we do, what might this look like, but really practical things like, well, how could I shift those shelves so that I have a little bit more community space over there? Or what exactly should I do with those rowdy teens that come in the library? So keeping learning is going to be a huge part in staying grounded in this field. That's all I have to say on this topic for now. I'm thankful to each of you for watching. You know how to get a hold of me if you have any questions. Do take care of yourself, and we're so excited to have you working in an Iowa library. I think this is going to be a great way for you to connect with your community and serve your patrons. Thanks so much.